Our next guest, he became the youngest candidate to run for council in 2015 on a city that was built on steel, coal and shipping, who was openly gay and who is not afraid to stand up for LGBTI rights, became the first gay openly Deputy Lord Mayor of Newcastle, Australia, and passionate about the city he lives, loves and works in. Declan Clausen, welcome to LGBTI Conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. You grew up in Newcastle, well, a suburb of Newcastle called New Lambton. Can you tell us a bit about growing up?
Yeah, I grew up in Newcastle. My dad was, up until fairly recently, an academic, and my mum a hospital administrator. I had a fairly suburban childhood, I think it would be fair to say, growing up in New Lambton, one of the suburbs of Newcastle. Went to some really great local public schools in New Lambton, and then on to Lambton High, where I was fortunate to be the school captain, and had a surprisingly good childhood experience listening to some young people whose experiences can be really traumatic at school. That was not my experience at all. I had a really great time at school and really loved being there, and really fortunate to have a great group of peers, although it has led to some reflection now at just how few openly LGBT people there were, both in my year group but also at school more generally. I went to high school with a pretty large group of students. My school had about 1,400 kids, and I can only think of a handful of people that were at that time open. And I do reflect on the degree of privilege that I had, that I was able to pass in a sense. And it wasn't until at the very end of high school that I came out as gay, and as I said, was very fortunate to have a very responsive and positive experience within the community, but not a large identifying community at that time.
Realising that you were different to the other guys within your school and adolescence, was that something that you were aware of during your high school period?
Well, yes and no. Yes, to the extent that a few other characteristics, happy to say, a fairly nerdy kind of guy. I've gone on and studied engineering and economics at uni, so have a particularly nerdy bent. Not somebody that's very sporty naturally, which not directly correlated, broadly relevant to my sexuality as well. I think that those things may be more different than my sexuality, but still found a great community and quite a welcoming community even then at school, and found that I was able to fit in despite having interests and skills that were probably not the norm.
And you were saying there were other adults, or teenagers I should say, within your school that were openly gay at that time?
Yeah, a really small number, some that I grew friendships with and certainly found to be amazing. It was a really small number of kids, particularly in the context of a school of 1,400. I think today it's widely accepted that the LGBT population is in the order of 10% of the population, thereabouts. Therefore, a school of that size, there'd be a larger number of kids that would have identified as LGBT. That wasn't my experience, though, through high school. And I think that as we've all become adults and grown a bit older, I'm now 30, so been out of school for quite a number of years now, that more and more of those people have become comfortable and have identified that the experience at high school, and probably synonymous with many people in my generation, was that it's only a relatively small group that were confident and comfortable and understood themselves enough in order to publicly identify as LGBT.
And it's quite interesting you say that, because I'm only about 10 years older again, but during my school period, I couldn't tell you of one person who was openly gay. So even in that small amount of time, it was a positive change happening then for kids who thought it was a safe environment to come out and be able to come out during high school, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, and remarkable how quickly that's shifted across. I'd hope that for somebody in high school today, so thinking of somebody in year 9 or 10 that's becoming increasingly competent, I'd like to hope that it's no longer an issue of such great divide, and that there are schools, particularly now in the Newcastle region, where it's very welcoming, where as people understand themselves better as part of growing up, do feel confident and safe, and I'd like to hope that that's the experience of more and more students as time has progressed.
I think we are moving in the right direction, and even in saying that too, we've now got TV shows that represent all kinds of diversity in the LGBTI community at school, at high schools, and it's being shown to a worldwide audience. So that's a leap in the right direction for sure.
100%.
Now, another interesting fact, you were actually the youngest ever candidate elected to Newcastle City Council. Now, that's a pretty major for you.
Yeah, Newcastle's an old city. We're the second oldest city in the country. We've had a council for well over 200 years. So to be a young person who stood for election, I was elected in an unusual series of events at a by-election in 2015. I was just 22 or 23 at the time, 22, I think, turning 23, and up against a fairly hotly contested election as a result of the way that the by-election came about. I have to say, though, I have been pipped. In the most recent council election, we saw more and more young people standing for civic office right across New South Wales, and I'd like to think that I had played a bit of a role in helping encourage young candidates to stand for councils across the state. But that also meant that I'm now pleased to be joined by another young person on the City of Newcastle Council. I've got a colleague, Callum Poole, who was just elected back in 2021, and he was elected when he was 21 years of age. So he's beat me by a couple of years there, but also really positive to see a real shift in local government. I think it is fair to say that for a long time, local government was stale and overwhelmingly male and quite pale. It is encouraging to see it become more representative of our communities, to have a greater diversity of voices reflected in council chambers, and for that to include not only LGBT candidates, but also young candidates and candidates from ethnic backgrounds, because ultimately, whilst local government might not be as sexy in terms of the decisions that we make as high levels of government, and particularly the allure of federal government, it does make really important decisions that do impact all of our citizens in our communities. And so ensuring that we're as representative as possible can only help ensure that there's a greater quality in terms of the decisions that are made.
Now, were you openly out when you first ran for council?
I was, and very fortuitously, my partner, Stephen, who I've been with now for 11 years, he was my campaign manager. So it was part of the package. It did lead, unfortunately, there was one of the opposition candidates who decided that was a point of difference that they really wanted to highlight during that election campaign, with a nasty homophobic shit sheet that was distributed around some suburbs, but reassuringly, actually, the suburbs where that piece of material was distributed were the areas where my vote was the highest. So I think that it had the inverse reaction to what that person had hoped, and instead saw a surge in the vote for the party that I represent, the Labor Party. So that was really positive. And
did you think at any point running for the election that your homosexuality was going to be a bit of a hot topic or a bit of an issue?
Well, I thought that it would come up because, well, not only due to as a young candidate and the unusualness of running as a young person, it was noteworthy in a council that had largely been run by older straight white men, that you'd have a young LGBT identifying candidate, that would be newsworthy, and indeed it was. I was fortunate at the time that a number of senior journalists, who I'm not going to name specifically, but all who identify as being part of the gay community, did ensure that lots of the press coverage at that time really did remain focused on the broader issues of local government, the policies and agenda that I was putting forward or that I was responding to that my opponents were putting forward. So at least in a media sense, the debate was always very respectful. There was, however, that underground discussion that I just referred to in terms of the negative material, but reassuringly, it didn't have the effect that my opponent at that time thought it might have had. And so I have to say I've been extraordinarily privileged in terms of the broad, welcoming public reception that I've had. I still, I'm sure we'll get to in a moment, I've played a fairly active role in the marriage equality discussion here in Newcastle in 2017, and listeners will be listening at some stage in the future, but today actually marks the 5th anniversary of the postal plebiscite result, which reaffirmed the right to get married. I've received hate mail as a result of it and continue to occasionally, but that is by no means the universal experience that I've had. By and large, people have been very welcoming.
Now, going back to getting elected as councillor, especially in Newcastle, because when a lot of people think of old Newcastle, they think of a mining town, a still city, a blokey bloke kind of situation where anything out of the ordinary is not really accepted. Think about it. It would have been kind of very nerve-wracking to think, well, is this the community that's going to get behind me and help elect me? But the more I kind of read into Newcastle as a whole and the history, there's this whole underworld of LGBTI community doing these amazing things.
Yeah, I could just definitely see elements of it. And what I've learned over time is that not only does Newcastle have an amazing gay history, but also that it is an overwhelmingly progressive community and extremely welcoming. And just to use the marriage equality vote as a way of quantifying just how welcoming it is, Newcastle had the highest yes vote outside of a capital city of anywhere in Australia. 3/4 of our residents voted yes, which was pretty extraordinary and did buck a trend to a degree in terms of what other result in other regional communities. A lot of that is tied up to the industrial history of Newcastle, the involvement principally of the trade union movement in Newcastle over very many decades, the principles of solidarity and social justice that do exist and continue to exist right through the Newcastle community that was well and truly applied to the way that many in Newcastle have perceived and become engaged with topics of relevance to the LGBT community. So I have to say I'm so proud to represent such a progressive city, which maybe from the outside doesn't look quite as progressive as it is. And I'm really pleased that on the ground that it is just as welcoming as it is. No doubt there is more to do in this space, and there's some really encouraging positive community work underway at the moment. Newcastle's going to be really proud in the new year to be the host of the opening event of Sydney World Pride. The first official Sydney World Pride event will be held in Newcastle next year. That's been done in partnership with a community organisation, Newcastle Pride Incorporated, which just recently held its version of Fair Day here in Newcastle. And I have to say, it was one of the largest community events I've ever attended. Literally thousands of Novocastrians flocking to Gregson Park, located in one of our suburbs, Hamilton, in order to take part in Fair Day and celebrate all of the amazing things and the diversity in the LGBT community brings to our city. An overwhelmingly progressive community based on long-held values of social justice that have evolved over time but continue to be applied to the views of the general population and the very welcoming nature of our general population here in Newcastle.
And you're very right. We came along to the Fair Day, and I was pretty blown away, to tell you the truth. Leanne done an amazing job there. I wasn't expecting it to be huge, but it was.
I don't think Leanne was either. I don't know that she was expecting it to be quite of the scale that it was. There is not a single negative thing that could be said about the Fair Day. It was just exceptional and so very popular.
Yeah, exactly. The amount of people that were there, and we're talking not just people from the LGBTI community, but all kinds of people from all walks of life all come together to celebrate, and it was amazing. It would give Sydney a run for its money,
which is special, and perhaps hopefully also help recast a view of what Newcastle is. As I was mentioning, the industrial legacy of Newcastle. Clearly, Newcastle still is an industrial city, and there's plenty of industrial elements to the city, but it's a city that is rapidly diversifying. We've got a whole range of really quirky startups in particular that are calling Newcastle home, taking advantage of a better quality of life that might exist as a result of not having to sit in hours worth of gridlock traffic and make use of true 20-minute neighbourhoods. We're really pleased to have an amazing coastline, the cleanest beaches in New South Wales and the like. It's wonderful that the re-imaging of Newcastle is taking advantage of that very welcoming nature as well, and that's part of the story that we've got to tell with the rest of Australia.
So very true. Now, cast your mind back to the equality. What do you remember during that time with the campaigns and what was going on in Newcastle?
I spent a fair bit of time out with the campaign doing door knocking and trying to engage with residents, encouraging them once the survey came out to complete and find their ballots and return their ballots. I have to say, the more and more doors that I knocked on, the experience by and large were people were remarkably positive, but it also acted really quickly to return their votes. It wasn't an uncommon experience to arrive at a front door to hear, no matter how the occupant might look, that they'd found the vote in their letterbox, they'd filled it out, they'd voted yes, and they'd returned it, and they were really proud and pleased to say that. I really want to reiterate that just how damaging and unnecessary the whole marriage equality postal plebiscite was, clearly had a profound impact on lots of young LGBT people. In particular, the fact that we had this needless national debate about the rights of queer people to marry one another, is a shameful act that we need to reflect on. And some of the arguments that got air at that time, I'd also, just to jump forward to the contemporary conversation, and although it's affecting a different community, it is obviously the right thing for all of us to do to vote yes in the upcoming referendum on an Indigenous voice to Parliament. as a mechanism of implementing the Uluru Statement and righting past wrongs. But we have to heed some lessons as a result of that, the marriage equality campaign, about the nastiness that can come through, but also the need for us to help overcome that by standing in solidarity with First Nations brothers and sisters and helping support and ensuring that there is an overwhelmingly positive yes vote to that national referendum. You don't get these opportunities all that frequently, and it's so critical that the result is a similarly positive yes for the Voice referendum. This time, a document that absolutely does need a referendum. It can't just be resolved by the Parliament like what could have occurred had an alternate approach been taken on marriage equality.
I totally agree on both, and especially with the marriage equality. I think it did breed a lot of hate, and it was also an emotional roller coaster ride for our community, because to drive by churches and other institutions and see huge banners, but seeing stuff like that, it hurt. And I know it hurt a lot of people in the community, and it's something that we didn't need to go through, and I think it caused probably a little bit more harm than good. It was great, the outcome, but I think it had a lot to do with a lot of people like yourself out there knocking on doors and basically getting out there and saying, we're like everyone else and we just want what's rightfully ours.
Yeah, I agree with you. And just, unfortunately, queer lives are political, and it requires us to be conscious of the rights that have been hard fought for over time. Acknowledging this one was needlessly debated in the way that it was, particularly when you look around an election in the United States, and I've been trying to follow as much of it as possible. Some of the commentary and the propositions put forward, particularly by Republican candidates and a portion of the Republican Party in that election, incredibly regressive for queer people, and something we do need to keep a watch on. I think that there's this view that rights are always gained and that we always move forward. Well, we just need to be very conscious that it does take very active engagement by our community to make sure that there isn't regression. And unfortunately, there are situations that you can point to elsewhere in the world where the rights of queer people are being removed right at this very minute. And it's not beyond realms of possibility that is something that we might experience at some stage in Australia if there isn't a very careful and considered, continually organised role of the LGBT community.
Definitely true there. We are fighters, but in saying that, we can't take everything for granted, because as you were saying, around the world, there is a lot of people that don't have very simple LGBTI right. And we're lucky in Australia that we've got it, but we also need to keep it that way as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you're the first ever openly gay Deputy Lord Mayor for Newcastle. Now, that's another pretty amazing achievement.
Yeah, I was very fortunate to be surrounded by a great team on council. So I've been fortunate to have served as the Deputy Lord Mayor of our city since 2017, having been re-elected each year to that role, and part of a great team of an overwhelmingly progressive council. My council is, just as a result of the most recent election, has a majority of female councillors, which is pretty abnormal for councils in New South Wales, but it also brings an additional positive slant to the style of issues that are discussed and considered. And that's a fact that's true across political parties and groupings as well. So including some of the groupings of conservative councillors. It's not something unique to the progressive side of politics. And to date, it has meant that the quality of the conversation in the council chamber has been substantially more respectful than the council that I was originally elected to. And I'm really pleased that we've moved in that direction, where the mutual respect shown despite fairly significant differences in political opinions.
Within politics, we've come a long way again with the LGBTI community. There is a fair few candidates throughout Australia who are openly gay and doing their job and doing their bit for the community. Do you ever think that we'll ever see a gay Prime Minister?
I think surely one day we will. I'd like to be optimistic that is going to be the case, reiterating and stating an awful lot of admiration and respect for our current Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, just an extraordinary gentleman and a real public servant in that role. And it's so refreshing, and sorry for being so partisan in my commentary, but it feels that the adults are back in charge in Canberra when I see the work that he's done both in Australia but also internationally over the course of the last 6 months or so since we had a federal election. Australia's still got a long way to go. Julia Gillard left office in almost a decade ago now. We had the anniversary, the 10th year anniversary of the misogyny speech only a few weeks ago. We have only had one female Prime Minister in Australia. And so whilst I think, yes, hopefully one day we do have, there'd be no taboo and it'd be appropriate that a LGBT person is elected as our Prime Minister, I do need to qualify my comment and go, but we've also got a way to go to make sure that it's not so abnormal for a female to be Prime Minister. I'd certainly like to hope that we get to a position where half the time, 50-50, roughly, you've got a mix of genders in that role, because there are some extraordinary female parliamentarians too that I would think would do a wonderful role in representing our nation at that level. So yes, a very optimistic yes. One day I would have thought that I'd like to hope that that's likely, and certainly Australia is becoming a country where that would be welcomed. But also, we do have a way to go.
Could we possibly see a PM after Declan's name for Prime Minister in the few decades' time?
It might be in quite a few decades' time. I'm honestly, the opportunity in local government is so significant. I mentioned that I'd studied in economics earlier, specifically looking at sustainable urban development and the role and growth of cities. I found there is so much opportunity within our councils. I've got some really extraordinary colleagues. Maybe one day, but I'm not going to rule anything out. Not certainly in the short term. I think that we've got a pretty good team in control at the moment.
It sounds like there's a lot more work that you'd like to do in Newcastle City before then.
Absolutely, yes.
Now, you were saying before your fiancé, Stephen, now got engaged. So what was the story with you coming out and meeting him?
Yeah, so we met at uni with a fairly political relationship all the way through, in that we met at the formation meeting of the Hunter Young Labour Association, a group, a party unit within the Labour Party, and was fortuitous timing. Stephen's training is as a primary school teacher. He was in his last year of uni when I was in my first year of uni studying engineering, and quite fortuitously met through the Labour Party of all places. It's meant that we've kept a fairly politically involved relationship in addition to our personal relationship, but also one of those chance meetings that happens as a result of an organisation like the ALP. Probably not all that different to, I suspect, how other people form relationships as a result of being involved in organised religion or organised sport. It allows people with fairly different interests and views to come together. And so certainly one of the positive things, in addition to being active obviously within the local gay community here in Newcastle, I found a real sense of community has come from being engaged in organised politics and engaging with people that have similar worldviews or want to achieve similar outcomes. And Stephen's one of those people that I'm so pleased to be able to work with every day in a personal and a political sense in order to achieve change. We're both very motivated to achieve progressive social change, and so lots of the philosophy in terms of our relationship and how we come together as two minds works alongside the personal, intimate relationship we have as a couple as well.
And it's good that you guys both are on the same team with your political parties, because that, I dare say, would minimalise any friction there in...
Well, look, most of the time, I think sometimes difference of opinion can still be found even within the same grouping. Labor doesn't necessarily use this frame quite so much as the Conservatives. So the Conservatives often say that they're a broad church. I think that's also true of the ALP. It was also somewhere where debate is welcomed and actively encouraged. So yes, broadly, we share a similar worldview and philosophy, which is wonderful and quite reaffirming. But that's not to say that there aren't times when we can have a pretty decent argument about some point of policy difference or the way that we would go about creating change. To be honest, it really helps. I'm so lucky to have somebody that I can bounce ideas off and can be so engaged in the work that I do as a councillor and as a deputy Lord Mayor, as a partner. I'm really very privileged, because it does create a safe space where we can really hammer out some of the harder issues. And politics is complicated. Lots of the issues, even at a local government level, are complicated. There's often complex strategy that goes along with some of the ideas. And I'm just so fortunate. I love him. Very great to have a life partner. He's so interested and involved in similar spheres.
And who proposed? That's a big question.
It was me. Political relationship as it was. Obviously, we were both pretty involved in the marriage equality campaign. And so it did mean, and probably fairly similar for lots of gay couples around the same time, where something that wasn't an option or was only an option if you were going to get married in the UK embassy in Sydney or consulate rather, or head across the ditch to New Zealand, It was a topic of active conversation for some time leading up to the result of the postal plebiscite about what would happen if it became legal in Australia. How would we take it forward? We've been engaged for a few years now. COVID, unfortunately, did interrupt our wedding plans. And so just as things have started to become more normal, every time we get back into a more normal period, then some curveball was thrown in. We're all going to plan, intending to get married either next year or the year after. So in the not too distant future, we'll be formalising and tying that knot.
Will Toby be part of the wedding party?
Almost definitely, yes. This is our doggo, Toby. He's a cavoodle. He's 7 now. Absolutely after the baby. Very well looked after. I sometimes probably claim him as being Newcastle's top dog. He certainly, he has also had a fairly involved role in politics. One of the initiatives that I'm most proud of, although being quite small and very community scale, is the work that we've done on fenced off-leash dog areas, for example, and delivering a dogs in open spaces strategy through council, opening up now a series of new off-leash dog parks, which have been really well received by the community. Just as an example of that, we put these out on public exhibition, not really sure what the community would think. We got absolutely bombarded, overwhelmed with positive submissions. Council spends about $100 million a year. We put out a budget on exhibition every year for that $100 million spend. It's got a list of all of the projects we're doing in the city. Last year, we got 6 submissions on that budget. The Dogs in Open Spaces strategy, we had well over 1,000 submissions and some really great ideas from the community, very, very welcoming in terms of the outcome. So Toby certainly changed my view on the value of having pets and dogs in open spaces, and clearly something that resonated pretty well with the Newcastle community too. So he's played a proud role locally. He's been involved in every dog park opening, and may there be many more that he can participate in.
And you're right, dog parks, well, dogs are a huge part of people's lives now. And of course, you want to take them to a safe environment where you don't have to worry about them. You can take them off the lead and let them run around. So it's great to see council actually build these parks, and they're not just a paddock anymore. Like, they're pretty amazing facilities for the hound.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I love most about the dog parks is, aside from obviously a great safe space where dogs can exercise and do their thing, but the conversations you have with their owners are always amazing. I love going down to the dog park and just striking up a conversation with the other people who are there exercising their dogs. You meet such a diverse cross-section of the community that I think would be hard to access in any other way. You just make these new connections with people that you probably don't have all that much else in common with, other than that you're both pet lovers. And it's a great, we've made some great friendships at the dog park. It's positive in terms of socialising dogs, but also I have learned in terms of socialising humans too, it has really helped.
Maybe we need a park for more socialising humans.
I think that there is some merit to that, and one of the concerns of the young queer community, I think, is that sense of isolation. There's more work to be done in what spaces look like in the modern world. So in the past, the role of community facilities, particularly where there were more limited options, I'm thinking of the role of public libraries and the like, played a pretty fundamental role in terms of the way the communities came together. How we do that in the 21st century is still being charted. It's less clear cut, and there's so many issues with the various social media platforms and how they interact and the style of behaviour that's acceptable there. I do think that there is something to it to be able to bring people back together face to face in a way that makes sense at a community scale. I don't have the answer there, but there's more to be thought about.
And in the perfect world, what do you see for the LGBTI community in Newcastle as a whole? What's the future look like to you?
Newcastle, so we've mentioned the long-standing queer history of Newcastle, and we've also had some great LGBT advocates over time who did things like take on NIB, the health insurer, about challenging businesses back in the 90s, their definition of what a couple was, and ensuring that discounts were provided if 2 men or 2 women were members of a couple's policy, as a heterosexual couple would experience. There's been some real groundbreakers there. I think as we move forward, I'd like to see more spaces within the city that are open and accepting of the queer community. There's a couple of schools of thought that I found intriguing in this space, one of which is that you go that the experience of LGBT people are that the community's become so welcoming that they're welcoming all community spaces, so you no longer have a gay bar or a queer bar, for example. All venues are welcoming. My own view, for what it's worth, is that there is still something uniquely different about growing up queer, and there is something still uniquely different about the queer community. And so no matter how welcoming and encouraging the broader community is, there is still value in having spaces that uniquely identify as queer spaces. Despite its long history of being a progressive city, Newcastle doesn't currently have a dedicated gay bar or a dedicated queer bar, for example. It's something that I would like to see changed. I don't have an immediate solution to that. Councils don't tend to get themselves involved in operating venues like that, but certainly in providing community spaces and a community venue, it's something I'm really interested in engaging more with our local queer community to work out how we would go about making it work. I think in terms of a population, the Fair Day highlighted, we've got more than enough supportive members of the community perhaps to make a venue profitable, and it has been a real surprise to me that despite having had gay bars on and off, for example, that they haven't been able to be maintained and they haven't been profitable in the long run. I think that's a real shame and is a disservice to an important part of the LGBT community.
And the amount of development going on in Newcastle at the moment, you'd think there'd be a golden opportunity for a proprietor to go down this road. And as you said, it's obviously viable. There's enough people from the community who are yelling out for it, who will support it. So there is an opportunity there for someone somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe talking to you this afternoon, somebody from outside of Newcastle that's got some capital and interested in opening a venue, hasn't really thought through a location. Maybe Newcastle's worth having another look at. And I certainly do think that there is that support from the community to make it work. We've just got to find the right person that's able to come in and help deliver on that vision.
For sure. Now, we all know that the LGBTI community loves to support theatre, Broadway. Now, Newcastle has a pretty magical theatre called the Victoria Theatre. It's over 130 years old. So at the moment, where's that sitting? I know it's sitting dormant at the moment, and there's been a few conversations about the future of it. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going to happen to this brilliant building?
Absolutely. So the Victoria Theatre is 130 years old, the oldest theatre in New South Wales. It has an extraordinary history. Incidentally, my day job as an engineer is working for the local water utility up here, probably fairly indicative of the views of the time. This extraordinary theatre that was built and designed in order to provide somewhere for the governor to come and be entertained when he came to Newcastle in colonial New South Wales. Existed before we had reticulated water, and certainly well before we had reticulated sewer. So it probably gives you some indication of the priorities of the colony at the period. And we're lucky to have this building that, despite having been remodelled a couple of times, remains largely in its original form from way back then, right in the heart of the city. Today, it would be a small-scale theatre able to cater for audiences of about 1,000, which, given that the council operates a large theatre, the Civic Theatre here in Newcastle, it actually provides this amazing middle-tier venue that could provide a home for live music in the city, but also for an increased variety of shows. It's relatively recently been acquired by Century Venues, the company that operates the Enmore Theatre. They've got a really impressive view to restoring and remodelling the Victoria. They've put the theatre itself into a charity trust, which is really positive. They've just recently been successful in receiving a couple of New South Wales government grants to the order of about $6 million, which will enable them to undertake the work to get the theatre back functional. There's still a broader upgrade that's needed. I think that they're after support of about $20 million in total to completely revitalise the theatre to ensure that it can be operated to its full capacity. But even with that smaller amount of grant funding that they've been successful for to date, Greg Curry, who runs Century Venues, has just got an extraordinary vision about how to bring that theatre back to life, and I'm incredibly supportive of it, really looking forward to seeing what might happen there, because a statistic that I often like to quote is that Newcastle boasts more artists and creative people per capita than any other city in the country. Having a number of creative venues that work well in collaboration with one another, and having the Victoria Theatre as a key part of that is going to be really positive in terms of the options that are open to Newcastle and the style of shows and cultural experiences that we're able to develop and attract from other areas too.
And I think that is important because Newcastle is the largest regional city in New South Wales and the second largest city in New South Wales. So I think for them to get more Broadway shows or off-Broadway shows is pretty critical, because not everyone wants to go to Sydney to see a show. There is outlying regional areas in New South Wales that just don't like to go to Sydney. So I think it's a great opportunity for these venues to get out there and get more Broadway shows into town for sure.
Absolutely. And there's a demand and certainly an audience based here in Newcastle. We've got Come From Away coming to Newcastle, a Broadway show in February and March of next year. It will be the first time in 30 years that we've had a Broadway show shown in the city. It's doing a 3-week run as its initial run. Tickets are selling incredibly well, just highlighting the community demand for good cultural experiences, and that there is a very warm and receptive community in Newcastle that want to go and see quality theatre in order to ensure that it is viable, and having another venue like the Victoria Theatre as part of that ecosystem can only help.
Pretty exciting times for the City of Newcastle.
Absolutely. It's been I've been involved in such a period of growth and renewal. We've really benefited from people looking outside of Sydney and the rest of metropolitan Australia, so Melbourne and Brisbane as well. During COVID, we've seen lots more Gen Zs and millennials look to move to Newcastle and are helping additionally in reimagining and continue on this evolution of creating a far more progressive and welcoming city. So a really exciting time to be in Newcastle. I mean that quite sincerely. We've gone through a period of change, but it's certainly creating a better city as a result.
Newcastle, who knew?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you're listening a little bit more as a result of our conversation this afternoon.
For sure. Check it out. Put it on your holiday list. Go to Newcastle. I think you will be surprised. It reminds me a little bit of the culture or the artiness of Melbourne mixed in with the coolness of Sydney, but then it's got its own coastal vibe. It's a very unique city. And it's definitely worth a trip. And I think a lot of people during COVID who kind of did move around and go on holidays ended up moving to Newcastle. Yeah,
and I like that description. I might borrow it. It's a good blend. We're definitely, we've taken some of the best bits of Melbourne, of Sydney, and it's been a large coastal city with great beaches. You've got, it's a mature enough and large enough place that it feels like a city. The broader Greater Newcastle region has got a population of about 600,000. So we're not small, but it's also easy to get around. Housing is expensive but relatively cheap compared to other areas in metropolitan Australia, and certainly that's providing a point of differentiation when people are looking around and realising that the COVID environment means that you can more readily work from anywhere in Australia or anywhere in the world, but still wanting to maintain access to all of the amenity and benefits that comes from the city, but perhaps without some of the chaos and frustration that comes from living in a capital.
So very true. Now, we ask all our guests this. If you could go back and tell your younger self anything, what would it be?
I think the advice that I would give myself is just to lean in some of those differences and recognise that there is a home within the gay community for people that are different.
Couldn't have said it better myself. LGBTI capital of New South Wales, soon to be Newcastle, no doubt. Openly gay Deputy Lord Mayor, which is pretty amazing. Declan, thank you so much for coming on LGBTI Conversations.
Cheers, I really enjoyed the chat.
Just a quick note on today's conversation. Since we recorded this, there's been some movement in the LGBTI venues in Newcastle, Australia. Newcastle has finally got a dedicated gay bar. It's called Bernie's. It's located on King Street in Newcastle. Go check it out on social media or Google Bernie's Gay Bar Newcastle, Australia. If you live in Newcastle or visiting, make sure you check it out. And like always, make sure you like, follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Until next time, I'm Anthony Doik, and you've been listening to LGBTI Conversations.